Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Madeleine Gabriel. I'm Head of Inclusive Innovation at Nesta, and I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this panel today on creating a sustainable digital future in Europe. As economies attempt to recover from COVID-19, many governments around the world have said they want to put sustainability at the heart of their plans. And arguably, the European Commission has led the way with its green recovery plans. The recovery deal announced in July earmarked nearly 550 billion euros for green projects over the next 7 years. And according to Reuters, that's the single largest climate pledge ever made. And meanwhile, the European Commission's industrial strategy, which was released earlier this year, set out a pledge to create globally competitive, carbon neutral, digitalised industry across Europe. And this green and digital transformation is the twin transition that we've referred to in the title of today's session. Now, digitalisation can, of course, make a big difference in making our activities less carbon intensive. If you just want to take this conference as an example, one study I read recently said that the carbon footprint of European conferences can be estimated as between 0.5 and 1.3 tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions per participant. So for a conference of this scale with about 600 participants, I'm told, this would mean at least 300 tonnes of CO2 emitted in total. By moving online, we can reduce up to 90% of those emissions. And for those of us who really don't like networking, there are all sorts of added side benefits of going online. But digital activities, of course, aren't emissions free, far from it. Today, the internet is estimated to produce between 5 and 9% of globally, or it's estimated to use, between 5 and 9% of globally generated energy. And of course, much of that is still carbon based. And that's before you count emissions embedded in the production of devices. I've recently read that to produce a smartphone, you need to mine, on average, 34 kilos of ores to extract the rare earth metals and the other minerals that go into making its components. And so that means that when a smartphone hits the stores, 95% of its lifetime emissions have already been created. And I should add that apparently Europeans buy more than 200 million smartphones each year. So what can we do to promote digitalisation in an environmentally sustainable way? Are we on the right course? And if not, what can consumers, businesses and policymakers do to get us on track? Here to discuss these issues with me today are 4 fantastic speakers. We've got Janet Gunter. She's an anthropologist and activist. She co-founded the Restart project in 2013 to address the throwaway consumerist model of electronics and to tackle the growing mountain of waste that it leaves behind. We've got Asim Hussain. He's a green cloud advocacy lead at Microsoft and also co-organiser of climateaction.tech and host of the Climate Fix podcast. Also joining us is Abel. He's an award-winning social entrepreneur, founder of Fairphone and more recently Clique. And he has a background in design and technology and is passionate about deepening the relationship between people and the products they use. And finally, we've got Currie. She's a sci-fi author and startup founder. She's just released the 4th book in her Panopticon series, alongside running her software consultancy company, which is called Container Solutions. And she's an expert in tech and ethics, amongst other things. So just to give you a flavour of how it'll work today, I'm going to ask each panellist in turn to give a short opening statement. And then we'll move on to a discussion. I'll be asking some questions, but as always, please do submit your questions. We'd love to hear from you as the audience. So while our panelists are speaking, give some thought to what you'd like to ask. And without further ado, Janet, are you there?
Hope you can hear me.
Wonderful, we can hear you. Janet, tell us what the issues are around device lifetimes, upgradability and the right to repair, and what are your views of what policy makers could do to address some of these? Over to you.
Brilliant. Well, just to introduce myself a little bit more, because I'm probably not a usual suspect here. I'm part of a small organization, and we're part of a larger, growing grassroots movement promoting repair at a community level and repair skills. So you may have heard of fix-it clinics or repair cafes. We call our events restart parties, but we all started springing up more or less around the same time, and actually inspired by activist in Amsterdam who started the Repair Cafe movement and kicked off this big movement in about 2009. since then, we've come together as a movement, at least at the European level, and we've created the Right to Repair Europe campaign, and very much to address the fact that we're not able to fix a lot of the stuff that people bring to our 3-hour community events. And so we see some common barriers to repairing consumer items, and a lot of these are used to get on the internet. So one of them is, they're not designed to be disassembled or repaired. A lot of people probably have experienced that. Another one is that we really struggle to get access to quality and affordable spare parts. Probably also those who have looked to replace a battery or a screen may have run into that. And the third pillar of the Right to Repair campaigns around the world is access to repair documentation and diagnostics tools. And these are increasingly mediated by the internet themselves. So we're looking at a big battle in the state of Massachusetts right now over a right to repair measure that's being voted on that's about telematics. And that's essentially the ability of independent repair shops to use diagnostics over the internet to repair vehicles of people, so that not just dealerships can repair cars. So that's kind of the Right to Repair campaign globally as it is. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the European opportunities, but I first wanted to talk a little bit about why we started what we're doing and about the internet itself. So we started running these repair events with our friends and in our communities, partly out of a disquiet about what the internet was becoming. So my co-founder and I, Ugo and I, we grew up in the 90s in the beautiful, anarchic early days of the internet. And we already, by 2011, felt ourselves losing some of that kind of DIY and hands-on spirit in relation to the internet. And a couple of years in, we already sensed that young people had never replaced a battery in an electronic item that they had, and that people thought of the internet as an immaterial cloud. And for us, this for us was sad in many ways, but partly because the internet's impact, as you mentioned, is embodied inside of hardware. So it doesn't just stop at data centers. And more, we thought that people did not really understand that routers, computers, IoT devices, mobiles all have this really strong embodied impact. And I guess we're also a little bit concerned with the language used in these circles, since people's knowledge is slightly evolving, and the potential for greenwashing. So, we've seen big tech net zero commitments that have been made this year. And we've heard a lot of, use of the word sustainable, resilient ecosystems, even in this program. But how are they being used? And so I think it's important that we keep a critical eye on the way some of these terms are being used, and that we become more literate and able to hold companies to account. It's true that big tech has made some bigger commitments than actual countries, but how is big tech held to account? To close, I just want to go through some of the opportunities that are at the European level, which are really big and on a global scale. So in Europe, we're the first place to link product standards around eco-design and efficiency to repair. And this is unique in the world. So this helps extend product life cycles. So those labels that we have on, let's say, appliances like washing machines and refrigerators that are for energy efficiency in the use phase, well, that process has been expanded to the full lifetime of products, which forces us to take into account the stuff that goes into their manufacture and then extend their life cycles via repair. So that precedent has been set here with large appliances mostly. And the Commission has been really vocal about the right to repair being fundamental in its circular economy plans. And there are some big opportunities for Europe to reduce the embodied impacts of the internet. And I'll go through them right now and building on that. So one is eco-design for smartphones and computers. And this has been one of our rallying cries earlier this year. The next is an ambitious work plan for the next 4 years that includes many more connected products and internet-related products. A third is a repairability index, like help us buy better products that will last longer. And then there's this tantalizing circular electronics initiative that's been mentioned by the Commission, but still light on the detail. So that's the good news. The bad news is that that oftentimes these processes move very, very slow. And there's a risk that by the time some of these laws come into effect, markets will have moved on yet again. And for many products, we can't expect this regulation, even in the middle and the long term. So we're pushing forward some country-specific action, and there's some really exciting things happening across the EU. Repair grants in Austria, repairability scoring in France, and the zeroing of or lowering of VAT rates for repair. And so these can also help push things forward. And then lastly, in relation to the digital market, there hasn't been much kind of discussion of these, all of these aspects of the internet in the single digital market policies. And we just want to kind of reinforce that to future-proof all of this and to make sure that we connect the dots, we need product policy that ensures long-term software and updates, security updates. So that's kind of maybe the thing that might join those two agendas the most, but we look forward to chatting with you and the panelists about everything else.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Janet. We'll come back to some of those issues because I think they're going to be really important for our discussion. But before we do that, I want to move on to Asim. Perhaps you could tell us more about the industry perspective on sustainability. You've heard maybe a bit of challenge from Janet there around greenwashing. Is enough happening? What else needs to happen? Over to you, Asim.
So I can only speak from the perspective of Microsoft, I suppose, with any level of intimacy. So my name is Asim. I'm what's called the Green Cloud Advocacy or Green Developer Relations Lead. Whatever makes the most sense to you is the title I would take. So my role inside Microsoft is to help figure out how to build software or applications, so how to build and run software in the most sustainable way. And software runs on hardware, so it's all kind of connected together. And inside my specific role and kind of what I've been driving a lot is kind of growing this nascent field of sustainable software engineering. Because my journey into this space, when I first realized that we had to, I had a moment a couple of years ago where I'd realized throughout my life, throughout my career, I had never, not once, in any technical meeting, in any architectural decision, in any discussion at all of a tech perspective, I'd never raised my hand and asked, well, of these options, which is the greener option? And I realized that's a discussion that doesn't happen anywhere. In entirety of my experience, I've never seen it happen once. And so that's something I wanted to change. Really researched a lot of this space, realized a lot of it, there is a lot of content here and thought, but a lot of it's very academic still. There are a few books, but they're very domain specific. My world is the cloud, which touches on everything, machine learning to a website, all these different things. So I started on a journey basically helping to kind of coalesce all that data together. We launched something called the Principles of Sustainable Software Engineering, which are kind of 8 principles, which you can use as a rubric to evaluate any technology. And the idea behind the 8 principles are that as a software engineer, your world is quite narrow. You know kind of software engineering pretty well. My journey into the sustainability space has been broadening that out. The more people I speak to, they're like, Asim, what do you know about, talk to me, Asim, about electricity. What do you know about electricity? I don't know anything about electricity. Well, now let's understand about electricity. And now I describe it as my world used to be, I used to think full stack was from the front end to a database. Now I know full stack is from user behavior to how electricity is bought and sold on a market, or to how a data center is built. How is a data center being called? And as soon as you broaden that knowledge up from a software engineer, it's really interesting to see options appear for how to build applications most sustainably. It's not just electricity. there's embodied carbon, there's networking, there's carbon intensity, there's a whole bunch of different aspects which if you can think about, then you can build applications more sustainably. In terms of kind of the industry perspective, from internally inside Microsoft, I mean, we made a large announcement. It's actually several, and in fact, we made 4 announcements in this year. The first one is the one only people seem to remember as the first one, which is the carbon announcement, which is about carbon negativity. I can tell you from internally inside Microsoft, I work with people. I'm very lucky to spend my time full time working with people who are working on solving this problem inside Microsoft, and it does make a lot of people sleepless at night to figure out how exactly are we going to reduce our scope 3 emissions, which is actually a big challenge. The headline is just carbon negative. It's actually relatively easy to achieve. Buried inside that announcement was we're going to reduce our scope 3 emissions, which is from the supply chain, by 55% by the end of 2030. And that's the thing that keeps a lot of us awake. That's the conversations that we're having all the time. Like, how do we actually build a data center with less carbon, with less embodied emissions? I'm in meetings sometimes talking to people about the contents of a service chassis and how it was made. And my background is making websites, so it's kind of a new world for me as well. So these are the kind of conversations that are happening inside Microsoft. Industry-wide, I would say that this year I am starting to have the feeling that things have kind of broadened out. But yeah, you're right. It's kind of a wait and see whether I believe in Microsoft's commitment. I see the movement happening inside. You have to believe me, and we have to believe the others. I do believe in holding companies to account. One of the things I very excitedly that happens inside Microsoft, I'm quite excited about, and I see happening all the time, is that we have town halls where Satya gets on stage, Satya Nadella, our CEO, and kind of gives answers Q&A questions. And I see our green team, kind of our internal. We have a very large internal green team, kind of 3,000 people strong, kind of grassroots, employee-led, green, people focused on sustainability. And they get up and they directly ask Satya questions, very pointed, very tough questions on sustainability. And he either answers or he says, I'll get back to you, and he does get back to you. And that's the kind of thing I think that we need to start doing to the industry broadly, because you're right, a lot of this stuff, when I talk to people about Microsoft's announcements, I peel back the layers so people really understand what's going on, because you can't really understand from the headline announcement what it means, because really our announcement was nothing. The headline was the carbon negativeness, but the meat of it was the renewables process and the 55% reduction on scope 3, and the fact that we're including scope 3 in our calculations. That's important, and I have to take people through that so they understand that's why we said that message. It's not clear to me often with other companies whether they are that clear, and I think it's on companies to make sure that they are extremely clear regarding their announcements. What does it mean? How are they going to be held accountable down the line? And I think that's what I can really say from the industry perspective. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you. We'll come back to some of those issues as well, thinking about the roles of different groups, different stakeholder groups in this transition. Baz, I wanted to come to you next. You've been involved for many years in creating ethical digital products. What are the challenges involved in doing that, and what are your thoughts more generally about how we get a sustainable digital future?
Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, to start with, when we talk about sustainability at Fairphone, we talk about both the environmental and the social impact throughout the whole value chain. That involves questions like, where do we get our materials from? We want to have them conflict-free, child labor-free mining. We focus on using recycled resources. We all know mining is bad in essence, but we still need these minerals because we don't have enough recycled resources. We look at manufacturing, how are phones made, and how are consumer electronic products made. For example, paying a living wage to the factory workers is what we really try to do and focus on, how difficult it is in settings like China. But there's also the aspect that has been touched upon many times already, and it's the design. How are phones, how are products designed, taking into account the environmental footprint? And we're talking a lot about energy consumption here, but with phones, as Madeleine, as you stated already, most of the harm is already done when we have the phone in our hands. So next to the to the CO2 emissions that we're talking about here, the carbon footprint, that, for example, also includes degradation of the land, water consumption, all of these things we have to take into account. And that's also one of the reasons why we believe at Fairphone that besides all the beautiful recycling programs there are, most of that recycling is still plainly stupid, because what happens is you put the phones in an oven and you burn them and you get out the minerals, which is not very smart, as I would put it. So we focus really on encouraging people to use their phone longer by designing the phone in a way that it's easy to replace parts. As Janet already said, it's a very simple, effective way to have a huge impact on the environment, a positive impact. It's a very simple calculation, actually. If you use the phone twice as long, you only need to produce half the amount of phones and use half the amount of materials, and you have half the amount of electronic waste. And core to this very problem is the business challenge that we have in disconnecting our business models from the use of resources. I was at a panel last week at the World Economic Forum, the sustainability meeting in New York, and that was about deep sea mining. And I'm not really deep into deep sea mining, I can tell you, but one of the discussions there was how for our energy transition, we need, and data storage and all these new technology, we need more and more of these rare earth and lithium and cobalt and all these kind of minerals. We just don't have enough from recycled resources. So what we're thinking about now is how can we scrap basically the 5 mile deep ocean from these minerals without even knowing what will happen there. The argument is we need them anyway for energy transition. It's for a good cause. But my question there would be: do we really need to own like 2 Teslas? Do we really need to store all these images and data? Do we really need to consume all this stuff? Without abundancy is the promise of energy. It's free because it's going to be solar. Abundance is the promise of data. Abundance is the promise of basically all the business that we have at the moment. And which I think is, if there's a whole world of minerals and mines and stuff connected to these abundances, which might be true in terms of energy, then I think we're going down the wrong road. So for me, to conclude with, what are the policies we put in place so that people buy less stuff they don't actually need? How do companies make sure that they produce products that you can use longer and market them in a way that you also have that we change the narrative into buying more instead of buying more, also make sure that you use products longer. But to do that, I think the biggest challenge for us would be how do we shift our economic models towards disconnecting growth from the use of resources. I'm really positive that we can get there with service models, with all kinds of new models. But we as consumers, we as manufacturers, we as producers of mining companies, we as politicians, we all need to look at our economic models and how much they actually facilitate this transition that we need towards a more sustainable use of resources, and connected to that also the CO2 emissions, the carbon footprint.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Baz. And again, we'll come back to some of those issues, I think, in the discussion. To finish off with our opening statements, I wanted to turn to Anne Currie. And you write about utopias and dystopias, and sometimes your view on, well, sometimes whether it's a utopia or just utopia is down to individuals' view, right? So what are the different futures you can imagine around digitalisation and sustainability, and are we on the right course?
Oh, well, that's a very interesting question. So what I do in my day job normally, or what I do with a lot of my time in the tech industry, is I used to be an engineer. I've been in the tech industry probably, I would say, from looking at you, a good many years longer than most of the folk here. And so I've seen a lot of changes happen during that time. At the moment, I help run a tech consumer, so company as the consumer, organizational movement for sustainable service. So trying to make it, so Asim was quite right when he said that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even a year ago, we just didn't talk about how servers were run or what our green footprint was in tech. And now we are starting to do that. And there have been some companies that have got ahead of that. They haven't needed the consumer push to do better. But some companies have really needed that. So, for example, Microsoft have done very well. They're already carbon neutral. Obviously, carbon neutral is just table stakes here. But they have good carbon zero targets. Carbon negative is nice, but as you said, it's not really the story. The story is about carbon zero and spreading it out more widely. Google massively ahead on this, so you can be guaranteed that if you're running your servers on Google hardware or Microsoft hardware, you're in a good position. But Amazon are about 10 years behind on getting to a good state for their cloud services. So, and they have needed some consumer pressure in order to do better. And so I've been part of the Sustainable Service Movement for 2024, trying to put pressure on everybody, but particularly Amazon. And with Amazon, they're both the laggards, but also potentially I think they have a great deal of good that they can do. They're the largest cloud provider, and now they are hopefully starting to get with the program and look at how they can power their data centers renewably, which is great. But we need to keep the pressure on, because we're in the terrible position at the moment that the only pressure on these people are these are my suppliers. These are companies that I love to use the work from. But the only way for us to keep the pressure on these folk is through consumers, or through they themselves deciding that they want to do it through the goodness of their heart. And Google have done well on that. Microsoft have done well on that. But Amazon probably do need a bit more of a shove in order to get where we need them to be. And consumers, that's fine. That's a great way of providing pressure. But in the long run, what we really need is some governmental pressure as well, because there is a limit to what consumers can achieve versus governments. They've just got a lot more power.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. I actually wanted to follow up on that with a question to all the panelists. We've been talking a bit about the role of different stakeholder groups in creating change. And you've just talked about consumers and government, and the role of the tech industry, in fact. What are the most, to start off with, what are the most powerful things we can do as consumers? So as individuals, what would you each recommend are the actions that we can take before we move on to some of those other groups? Actually, Janet, I'll come to you first on that.
Okay, well, I will always answer this question the same way, and hopefully I don't get edited out in the media, which is you can take action as an individual, but you have to address the system level issues. You have to get behind change at a system level. So yes, use everything longer, buy conscientiously the best you can, but we need better information about products. We need support from at the system level, the policy level. We need to know which products we can use for longer, and we need, the market will not fix this problem. Just as Anna was saying, we can't expect these companies to fix the problem. Like, the companies we're talking about are so big that you have thousands of employees, as the case of Microsoft, working on greening up their cloud, greening up a lot of their operations. And then you have the same company releasing totally non-repairable products. I mean, it's just a fact. Not all of them, some of them. So the question is, how do we change that at a system level? And for everything we do as individuals, and we pat ourselves in the back for, we really need to be trying to at least spread the word, at least make a difference at a system level.
That's great, thank you. Baz, what's your perspective on this? Are there actions we can individually take? How can we shift the system, if at all?
Well, to me, it does come back to the individual level, but I'm not talking about being a consumer only. And in my opinion, like big multinationals, and sorry to say so, are they're big sociopaths in that sense, that they're not set up to think like human beings. That makes them so kind of it makes it a paradox in these kind of environments. The great news is that actually like Asim, there's so many people that passionately work on these subjects, and I'm pretty sure that if you know people in these companies and you can inspire them, and you have these conversations with people, and people have them amongst each other, they are also able to to change the culture in their own organization. It's designers that actually also can ask these questions. It's like, why the hell am I designing again something that is not repairable? What is the design from the inside out principle, where you think about what's in the product and how do you make it outside, instead of just looking from the outside. It has to be like this aesthetical thing. It's driven a lot by marketing. It's driven a lot by shareholders. Shareholders are you and me as well, with pension funds. Yeah, so I don't believe in that it's only consumers that have to, or customers that have to take the first step. But I do believe that we as individuals have a very, very strong position towards moving companies from within the companies, from outside the companies as shareholders, from a consumer perspective, to do so. And I see that also by doing that, you're creating space, kind of a safe space for companies, because that's also the side. Companies are risk averse. They don't get rewarded a lot for the risk that they take in terms of trying to do good. If you look at the supply chain, especially mining, there's a lot of child labor still involved. It took us a long while to get Glencore and these big tech giants that we all know to actually join a coalition on fair cobalt mining. But they've done that, and they've done that because the conversation around it, also with NGO stakeholders, have turned into a much more mature conversation on what are the dilemmas that you run into. It's not as black and white that there's people dying in the supply chain because Microsoft or Google or whatever company wants to sell more stuff. It's a bit more nuanced. So get that to another level by having these discussions with people, and don't expect it from companies to really do it by themselves.
That makes sense. Thanks a lot. Anne, I think you've recently reflected on the power of tech workers to influence change from the inside. What can you tell us more about that? What do you think's in their scope?
I agree with both of the speakers up until now. The bad news is, as an individual, you have pretty much no power whatsoever to change what's going on in the world in terms of climate change at the moment. But the good news is you are not just an individual. You are also part of a larger group of individuals. So you need to step back and think about what group you're in, and what group, think slightly more politically. If you care about this, where can you put pressure as a group rather than as just you? Unless you're like the Prime Minister of the UK, you don't have an awful lot of power. In the tech industry, the interesting thing is that in the tech industry workers is who I'm normally talking to. And they all have a lot more power than they believe, a lot more power than they realize, because they are part of companies that can put a lot of pressure on suppliers. So rather than make individual change, what they really need to do is raise it within their company and sell within their company that company wants to take a stance on this. And oddly enough, even for a lot of tech workers, they don't even need to do that. They can just go to their suppliers and say, I represent this company and I care about these things. And the suppliers will take it as probably that company cares about these things. You don't even necessarily need to get it signed off. You have a surprisingly large amount of power, especially with something that's essentially non-controversial. If you're saying, we'd really like you as a supplier to show us your plan for how you're going to be carbon neutral, and then carbon zero, and then carbon negative. Nobody in your business is going to complain at you asking for that plan. You can do it. You don't need any sign off. It's utterly trivial for you to make that statement and exert your power in that way. So do it.
Fantastic. Asim, do you agree with that? What are your additional perspectives from your experience?
I could talk for about 20 minutes on this topic alone.
Maybe one minute.
I'll give you 1 minute. Okay, so I think that I would say that saying that your voice doesn't count is like saying your vote doesn't count. We vote in elections en masse, and then if enough of us vote, we make changes. And I would say the same happens inside organizations. One of the things I do think quite strongly, actually, is that it's a cognitive bias to anthropomorphize kind of companies, to think of companies themselves as kind of, good or evil. Whereas I always argue that actually all that a company is people. It's just a whole load of people. And then, it saddens me sometimes when I hear people saying, the other day somebody mentioned to me that they weren't going to join the renewables arm of a fossil fuel major, and they're quite proud of it. And I remember thinking, well, how is that company ever going to change if good people don't join, if good people don't rise through the ranks and become the leaders, and make that change happen from above? The other thing what I see inside organizations is there are people inside my leadership chain, like all the way up to the top, who want to make those kind of brave decisions, but they feel alone. They don't feel like they have the support of their peers. They're scared. They've spent their entire lives kind of climbing these ladders and kind of making doing good work. When they see that there is an audience, when they see that there are a large number of employees of the firm care about this topic, it emboldens them to make those kinds of decisions which we need people to make. So I think you have a lot of power as a voice. The very last thing I'll say, actually, the one thing I love is a colleague of mine in Climate Action Tech, Sandra Pallier. She runs, she didn't start it, but she runs very regularly a program called 11 at 11, which is every Friday, everybody in her group and a couple of other companies now strike for 11 minutes at 11 a.m. It started in 2019 when it was to signify we had 11 years left. And they stand at the bottom of the building, outside the front, with placards, and they talk about climate change. And people coming in and out of the company, they see it. They see it all the time. And they stop them, they ask them questions. Well, talk to me about this. What's going on? How is this company? How is it having a part to play in this? And the other thing that I've heard is that in other companies, people, by the time 11 a.m. on a Friday happens now, the CEO shouts across the room, "Are you going to go down for the..." It's like accepted. It normalizes the whole process. It emboldens leadership to make them know they can make those kind of decisions. So that's... I could talk for another 20 minutes about this, but I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to move on to a slightly different topic. It's a question that's come from the audience, but someone's pointed out, Marie Derwent has pointed out, we've been talking a lot about reducing the impact of existing processes, but what are the opportunities in new innovations? And she's mentioned green search or greener way of building websites. Asim, you talked earlier about the principles of green software development. We've also had another question on edge computing and decentralization, and whether that will give more computation to our devices, but could it also mean we see more centralized services and more video streaming? So what direction is innovation taking us in at the moment? What do you think are the most promising innovations in terms of sustainability and digitalization, and any other reflections on some of those questions? Asim, I'm going to come back to you actually, because I think one of these questions was directed at you, and then I'll move on to the other panelists. Asim, go ahead. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were going to come back to me later on.
Sorry, come straight back to you, I meant.
Straight back, yeah. So, I think as well, I think it's tough to actually give clear answers, because especially with the edge computing one, yes, it's true. Edge computing actually has a lot of people are quite excited about edge computing from a sustainability perspective, because often pushing some of that computation over to the devices can sometimes help, especially when we talk about large, if there's a lot of network communication between a server and a client device. If you move that computation to the client device, then they don't need that communication. But then again, that's a balance between, well, then now you have to look at is that client device, is it now running too hard? Is a server, in fact, more efficient at running this kind of computation, and it's actually better to do the networking? So it's again, like everything sustainability, it's kind of, it depends. But you have to look at it. But the important thing, and this is kind of why the principles of sustainable software engineering are important, because they give you that kind of understanding of, well, there's this advantage, but really you're making a trade-off here, so you need to understand the difference. For edge computing, the common kind of advantage use case I hear a lot of the time is from a machine learning perspective, because oftentimes with machine learning, people talk about the cost of training a machine learning model, but actually inference, the use of a machine learning model consumes more electricity, just because it's used a hell of a lot more, and therefore running that oftentimes on a client device and kind of avoiding the network bandwidth is a solution. But again, it depends on the context, and unfortunately that's the answer. Is it depends.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And from your perspective, are there innovations, either technological innovations or I suppose innovations in practices, that you think are particularly promising in reducing the environmental impact of digital technologies?
Sorry, sorry about that. So what I was saying was, we often think about these things in the wrong way. So we look at ways of optimizing our development rather than ways that will be which are easier and more realistic in the long run. So, for example, rather than writing a more efficient web server, we'd probably be better off just using a cloud service which is optimized for that and is already running on renewable power. Because actually, the centralization in cloud and cloud data centers means that they're much easier to power renewably in the long run, and we've got big companies looking at ways to do that. One thing that we have talked about an awful lot here, and I think is really, really well worth stating again, is Janet's point about reuse. Because powering data centers and the actual power that goes into running applications, whether in the edge or in a data center, is actually quite a small percentage of the total lifetime cost of an application, whether it's the power that you're using to run it at home, your phone or your laptop, or the construction costs. So almost, I think she's right, that one of the things that we really, really need to be focusing on is how we make sure that our devices are not thrown away. I've got a phone here that it's perfectly good, absolutely could last for years yet, and it's already out of warranty for security patches. That's just a perfectly good piece of hardware that's going in the bin. Well, not going in the bin, it's going to be recycled, but could have years of additional use. So we often concentrate on the things that are very obvious to us, and we don't focus on the things that are even more important and less obvious.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody. I don't know, I feel like I'm in equal parts optimistic and fearful as a result of all of those discussions. But I do, I'm really I like the idea of disconnecting. I think this is what one of the speakers said. I can't remember who, but disconnecting growth from the use of the Earth's resources. I jumped in here because I think Madeleine's connection broke. But are you back online, Madeleine?
I'm online. Yeah, I'm very sorry. I got a
no
confusing.
problem. These things happen. Would you like to jump in once more and wrap up the session?
Yes, I think. Well, I think we heard some really interesting things. All the panelists really confirmed that while individual action can be meaningful, what we really need is policy change to underpin it and to encourage companies that are ahead to keep doing that, to encourage the laggards to keep up. And it was really interesting to hear about some of the initiatives that are already underway, for example, around the right to repair, both what can be achieved at European level and what can be achieved in country. I think the conclusion, the real takeaway I brought from that session was really around how awareness of the environmental impact of digital technology has been quite low, but does seem to be increasing now. And I think we heard some really great ideas about how to continue to raise awareness both amongst consumers and amongst people who are working in the system. And I think the most inspiring thing I heard was around the ability of individuals to make change if they just take a step back and think about their political impacts. I think politically about these issues. You know, how can realise you're not just an individual but part of a bigger system, and you can join with others to influence that system.